The day Hester Pritchard rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, she carried two things on the back of her roan mare: a worn leather saddlebag stuffed with everything she owned, and a weight so old and familiar she had nearly forgotten it did not belong to her. The weight was her mother's. Clara Pritchard had died 3 years prior in a boarding house in Abilene, thin as paper and twice as fragile, her hands clutching a letter she had never sent, and her eyes fixed on something no one else in the room could see. The letter, as Hester had later discovered after reading every word of it twice and then a third time in the yellow lantern light, had been addressed to a man named Thomas Granger of Caldwell, Kansas. A man her mother had loved before duty and fear, and a father's hard fist had driven her to marry someone else entirely. A man her mother had left without a word of explanation, without a goodbye, without even the courtesy of the truth. The letter said only this: "I was a coward. I hope you have found a better life than I gave you the chance to offer me. Forgive me if you can." It was unsigned. Clara Pritchard had carried that regret for 30 years, had worn it into the lines of her face and the stoop of her shoulders, had let it hollow her out until there was almost nothing left of the woman she might have been. And when she died, she had passed it to Hester the way a person passes a stone to someone standing beside a river, not with intention, perhaps, but with a kind of inevitability that made the receiving of it feel like gravity. Hester was 31 years old. She had spent the last 3 years running her mother's boarding house into the ground, and then selling what was left of it to settle Clara's debts, and now she was riding toward a town she had never visited, carrying a letter written to a dead man, because she had made inquiries, and Thomas Granger had passed on 2 winters ago, and she was not entirely sure what she intended to do when she got there. Deliver the letter, maybe. Find his family if he had any. Say the words her mother never could, even if they landed on strangers who had no reason to care. It was a fool's errand, she knew that. She went anyway. Caldwell in the spring of 1882 was a town on the edge of itself, a cattle town that smelled of dust and manure and ambition, with a main street wide enough to turn a full cattle drive and boardwalks that rattled when the wind came down from the north. It sat just above the Oklahoma border, close enough to Indian territory that a person could stand at the south end of town and feel the wild earth breathing. The cattle season had not yet begun in full, and the town had that stretched, anticipatory quality of a place holding its breath. Hester tied her mare at the rail outside the general store and went in. The woman behind the counter was broad and efficient, with the kind of face that had heard everything and was no longer surprised by any of it. Her name was Margaret Soules, as the sign above the door indicated, and she was measuring out flour when Hester pushed through the door. "I am looking for information," Hester said, keeping her voice even, "about a family named Granger. Thomas Granger, I understand he passed away." Margaret Soules looked up slowly. "Thomas Granger did pass, 2 winters back." "Why are you asking?" "I have something for his family, a letter, a personal matter." The woman's measuring hand slowed. She studied Hester for a long moment, the dusty traveling clothes, the straight spine, the calm eyes that held something carefully controlled beneath them. "His boy runs the Granger spread now, Henry. He comes into town most Fridays for supplies." She paused, seemed to decide something. "You are 3 days early. You can wait or you can ride out there yourself. The ranch is about 6 miles southeast, past the creek crossing. You will see the fence line before you see the buildings." Hester thanked her and bought a tin of crackers and a small wheel of hard cheese, because she had not eaten since early morning, and then she stood on the boardwalk outside and looked at the town around her. 3 days felt like a long time to sit still. She had never been good at sitting still. She rode southeast. The land opened up around her as she left the town behind, stretching out in that particular way of Kansas grassland, rolling and enormous, the sky so big above it that a person could feel very small and very free at the same time if they let themselves. The grass was still winter pale in places, but the green was coming up through it in bright, insistent patches. A hawk hung in the air to the west, barely moving. The creek crossing Margaret Soules had mentioned was shallow and quick, cold enough to make her mare throw her head when she waded through it. The fence line appeared exactly when promised. It was good fence, not ornate, not showy, but solid and well-maintained, the kind that spoke of a man who took his work seriously and did not let things fall apart out of laziness or inattention. The posts were set straight and the wire was tight, and even from a distance Hester could see that the land inside it was cared for. The grass had been managed, not just grazed to ruin. There was a windmill turning in the middle distance, and beyond it, the low brown shape of a house and 2 barns. A man was working a horse in the yard when she rode up. He was perhaps 35, with the particular build of a man who had spent his whole life doing physical work. Not large in the way of a laborer, but rangy and capable, with wide shoulders and hands that looked like they knew exactly what they were doing. His hair was dark and needed a cut, and he had 3 days of stubble on his jaw. He was working the horse on a long line, moving it in circles, his voice low and steady as he directed it, and he did not look up immediately when she reached the gate. When he did look up, his eyes were a dark, quiet brown, and they held the same quality as his fence, attentive, steady, not given to waste. "Help you," he said. Not unfriendly, but not effusive either. "I am looking for Henry Granger." "You found him." Hester dismounted. Her legs were stiff from the ride, and she took a moment to shake them out before she walked toward the gate, which he opened for her without being asked. Up close he was taller than he had seemed, a few inches over 6 feet, and there was something in his face that was more complicated than simple handsomeness. It was a face that had thought about things and arrived at its own conclusions. "My name is Hester Pritchard," she said. "I rode from Abilene. I have something that belonged, well, that concerns your father." The steadiness in his face did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "My father has been dead 2 years." "I know, I am sorry." She reached into her saddlebag and withdrew the letter. It was still in the original envelope, though the envelope was worn soft from being handled so many times over the years. "This was among my mother's things when she passed. Your father and my mother, they knew each other a long time ago, before either of them married anyone else." She held the letter out. "She never sent it. I thought someone should know that she was sorry." Henry Granger looked at the envelope for a long moment without taking it. His jaw moved slightly as though he was working through something. Then he reached out and took it, turned it over in his hands, looked at the faded ink of his father's name written in a woman's careful hand. "Clara Pritchard," he read. "My mother." He was quiet for so long that a crow somewhere behind the barn had time to call out twice and fall silent again. Then he said, "You want to come inside?" She had not expected that. She had expected to hand over the letter and ride back to town and find somewhere to sleep, and then, when the hollow feeling in her chest had settled, figure out what she was going to do next with her life, which was a question she had been avoiding with some dedication for 3 years. "I do not want to put you out," she said. "You have ridden 6 miles with something that has been sitting on somebody's chest for 30 years, he said. "Least I can do is offer you coffee." The inside of the Granger house was clean in the way of a house where a man lived alone, and had made his peace with it, functional, ordered, without the personal touches of a woman's hand, but without the neglect of someone who had given up either. There was a fireplace with a good draw and a kitchen with a wood stove that had been recently cleaned. A wooden table with 4 chairs sat near the window, and on the wall above it hung a framed photograph of a man and woman who Hester did not recognize but could guess at. Thomas Granger and his wife, she supposed, both of them stern and upright in the way of formal photographs from the era. Henry Granger made coffee and set it on the table and then sat across from her and opened the letter. She watched him read it. She had read it so many times herself that she knew every word, and she watched it move through him, the slight tightening of his mouth, the moment when he set the letter flat on the table and pressed his palm against it as though steadying something. "He never talked about her," Henry said. "Not once." He picked the letter up again, read the last lines. He would have forgiven her. He was that kind of man. "I believe my mother knew that," Hester said. I think that was part of what made it hard to write. He looked up. How long did she carry this? 30 years. She wrote it when she was dying. Something moved across his face, not quite pain, but related to it. He folded the letter and set it back in the envelope and placed it on the table between them. I am sorry about your mother. I am sorry about your father. They looked at each other across the table for a moment, two strangers connected by an old grief that neither of them had chosen. And then Henry Granger got up and refilled both their coffee cups, and the moment passed into something easier. Where are you staying in town? He asked. I have not arranged anything yet. The hotel on Main is decent. Mrs. Calloway runs it and she does not put up with nonsense. He paused. How long are you planning to stay in Caldwell? It was a reasonable question. Hester had not been able to answer it for herself, and she found she could not answer it for him either. I am not certain, she said. I sold my mother's boarding house before I left Abilene. I do not have anything pulling me back. He absorbed this without comment, the way a man absorbs information he has not yet decided what to do with. She finished her coffee, thanked him for his time, and rode back toward Caldwell in the afternoon light, which had gone gold and long shadowed by then, the grass glowing in it like something lit from inside. Behind her, she was aware that she had left something in that kitchen, not the letter which she had already given away, but something else, some piece of the weight she had been carrying, so small she could not have named it if asked. She did not think about it until later, when she was sitting in the hotel room Mrs. Calloway had provided and the town was settling into its evening sounds outside the window. The weight was still there, but it felt, fractionally, less than it had this morning. The following Friday, Henry Granger came into town for supplies, as he apparently always did, and he found Hester Pritchard in the general store, negotiating with Margaret Soules about the possibility of part-time work. Caldwell was a cattle town with seasonal rhythms, and the general store was about to get busy as the drovers moved north and the ranchers pushed into their busiest months. Margaret had been handling it alone, since her husband's accident the previous summer had left him unable to work a full day. Henry stood in the doorway for a moment, taking this in, and then he stepped up to the counter and waited while the negotiation concluded, which it did, in Hester's favor before he greeted either of them. Miss Pritchard, he said. Mr. Granger. There was a brief, slightly awkward pause of the kind that occurs between two people who have shared something real and are not yet sure what that makes them to each other. You stayed, he said. It was an observation, not an accusation. I told you I had no reason to go back, she said. He nodded. He bought his supplies: flour, salt, a tin of tobacco, a new coil of rope, and he was halfway out the door when he stopped and turned back. There is a church supper Sunday evening, he said, addressing some point slightly to the left of her face. It would not be, that is, if you are going to be in town, it might be a good way to meet people, since you will be working here. It was possibly the most awkward invitation Hester had ever received, and she had received several over the years from men who were nervous or clumsy or both. Something about it made her feel warm in a way she was not quite ready to examine. I will think about it, she said. He nodded and went out. She went to the church supper. It was held in the hall beside the First Methodist Church, which was a small white building with a bell that worked, which made it better appointed than many frontier churches. The hall was full of the kind of people that made up a working cattle town: ranchers and their wives, a handful of merchants, the sheriff and his deputy, 3 women who ran the local laundry together, a doctor of questionable credentials but genuine skill, and various cowboys who had cleaned themselves up to a degree that varied widely in its success. Henry Granger was already there when she arrived, standing with 2 other men near the far wall, his hat in his hands, cleaned up and wearing a jacket that had seen better years but was pressed and decent. He looked over when she came in and gave her a nod, and she nodded back, and then she went to speak to Mrs. Calloway from the hotel, who was standing near the food tables, and introduced her to several people in quick succession. By the end of the evening, Henry Granger had found his way to her side twice, once when the conversation naturally drifted that direction, once less naturally, and they had talked about the upcoming cattle season, the condition of the roads between Caldwell and Wichita, and whether it was going to be a dry summer. None of it was remarkable. All of it felt, to Hester, like the beginning of something, though she was careful not to put that feeling into words even inside her own head, because she had learned some years ago that naming things too early had a way of frightening them off. She walked back to the hotel alone in the cool spring night, and for the first time in a very long while, she did not think about her mother before she fell asleep. The cattle season came in earnest in late April, and Caldwell came alive with it. The dust, the noise, the constant movement of men and animals and money. The Texas Longhorns came up the Kisham Trail in thousands, heading for the railhead, and the town swelled to twice its off-season size with drovers and buyers and the various other people who attached themselves to the edges of the cattle trade. The general store was chaos. The hotel was full, and Hester worked 12 hours most days and was grateful for it. Henry Granger came in every Friday without fail. He was not a man who wasted words, she had learned. He said what he meant and did not say what he didn't, and in a town full of men who talked loudly and performed their confidence for an audience, this quality struck her as increasingly valuable the longer she knew him. He had opinions about things about the land, about the ranching trade, about the complicated politics of the cattle business, about the injustices done to the Comanche and Cheyenne who had been pushed off this same land a generation ago, about which he spoke with a plainness that surprised her and made her respect him. But he did not offer them unless asked. She began asking. One Friday in May, when the store was quieter than usual in the mid-afternoon lull, she asked him about his ranch. He had a few hundred acres along the creek. He told her, good grass, decent water even in dry years. He ran about 200 head. He had 3 hands who helped during the season, good men, and one of them, a Chickasaw man named Ray, who had worked the land alongside Henry's father and who knew more about horses than anyone else in the county. "Do you like it?" she asked. "Ranching." He thought about this longer than most people would have. "I like working land," he said. "I like that when you do something right, you can see it. The fence is either sound or it isn't. The cattle are either healthy or they aren't." He paused. "I like that it doesn't lie." She thought about this for a long time after he left. Her mother's life had been full of lies, small ones, performed ones, the lie of a marriage entered into without love, the lie of contentment worn like a dress that didn't fit. Clara Pritchard had not been a dishonest woman by nature. She had been a frightened one. And fear, Hester had come to understand, was one of the most effective engines of dishonesty there was, because it dressed itself in so many respectable clothes. She had spent most of her adult life trying not to be her mother, which was its own kind of burden, the effort of constant resistance, the weight of the alternative that she had always been running toward without being entirely sure what it looked like. Something about Henry Granger's plainness, his uncomplicated relationship with the truth of a thing, made the running feel less necessary. In early June, she accepted his invitation to ride out to see the ranch. It was a Sunday, her day off, and he came into town with 2 horses and met her outside the hotel at mid-morning. The second horse was a good-natured bay who did not object to being ridden by a stranger, and they rode southeast through the warming morning, talking more than she would have expected, the conversation moving between comfortable and something more charged that neither of them reached for directly. The ranch in full spring was beautiful in the unshowy way that working land tends to be beautiful. The grass was high and green, the cattle grazing quietly on the far hillside, the windmill turning in a steady breeze. Ray was mending a gate near the first barn when they arrived, and he acknowledged Hester with a nod that was courteous and assessing in equal measure. Henry introduced them, and Ray said, "He has been talking about you," with a complete absence of embarrassment that seemed to be characteristic of him, and Henry's expression shifted into something between irritation and resigned acceptance. "He has not given me his side of that particular conversation," Hester said. Wouldn't have anything interesting in it, Ray said, and went back to his gate. She liked Ray immediately. Henry showed her the ranch, the barns, the pastures, the stretch of creek that ran cold and clear through the eastern corner of the property, the stand of cottonwood trees that his father had planted 30 years ago and that were now tall and full-leafed, and provided shade enough for a dozen cattle at a time. He showed her the garden plot behind the house, which was going to seed for lack of attention, and the root cellar, and the back bedroom that he used for storage and had some idea of clearing out. He showed her the land the way a man shows something he loves to someone he is beginning to trust. She noticed this. Standing at the fence on the south side of the property, looking across the long roll of the grass toward the Oklahoma border, with the afternoon sun hot on her shoulders and the smell of the land around her, grass and cattle and water and good earth, Hester Pritchard felt the weight shift on her back. Not disappear. Just shift, like a saddle being adjusted, and for a moment she was aware of it in a new way, the way you sometimes become aware of something you have been carrying so long you have stopped feeling it as separate from yourself. "You love this land," she said. "Yes," he said simply, without qualification. "It shows." He looked at her. The afternoon light was doing things to the shadows on his face, making him look like a painting of himself. "My father loved it too," he said. "He used to say that land doesn't forget that it holds everything that happens on it the way water holds the shape of a stone." He paused. "I used to think that was something old men say. Now I think it might be true." "What does this land hold?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Good things, mostly. Hard work. Some grief. My mother died young, and my father," he stopped. "He was lonely for a long time. I understood it better when I read that letter." The letter. She had almost forgotten for a moment that the letter was the reason she was here at all. "I am glad she wrote it," Hester said, "even if it was too late." "Might not have been too late exactly," he said. "He died knowing she had loved him. That's not nothing." They stood at the fence a while longer. The cattle on the far hillside moved slowly. The creek made its quiet sound. When they rode back into Caldwell in the late afternoon, the town was busy and loud with end-of-week noise, and Hester realized she had been gone all day and had not thought about the boarding house she had sold, or the life she had left in Abilene, or the question of what she was going to do with herself. She had just been here, present, breathing, noticing things. She could not remember the last time she had been able to do that. On a Tuesday evening in late June, the peace was interrupted. A man named Dalton Purvis rode into Caldwell with 3 other men and took rooms at the hotel, and within 12 hours of his arrival, he had managed to get into a loud argument at the saloon, had made 3 separate people uncomfortable in the general store, and had found out, through what means Hester could not determine, that she had recently come into possession of some money from the sale of a boarding house in Abilene. He presented himself to her at the general store on Wednesday morning, a broad man with an oil-smooth manner and small eyes that did not quite match the warmth he was performing, and he told her that he was a cattle broker and an opportunity had arisen that would suit a woman of investment-minded temperament. Hester had grown up watching men like this circle her mother. "No, thank you," she said, pleasantly but without any opening for negotiation. He tried again Thursday. She declined again. On Friday, when Henry Granger came in for supplies, he noticed something in her face, a tension she had been maintaining carefully, and waited until Purvis and his men had left the store to ask her about it. She told him, keeping it brief, keeping her voice practical. She was not frightened of Dalton Purvis exactly. She was experienced with his type, and she had learned long ago that the best defense against a man who wanted what you had was to be very clear that you had no intention of giving it. But Henry's face went still in that particular way of his that she had come to recognize as the opposite of passivity. It was, she understood, the look of a man who was deciding something. "If he bothers you again, you let me know," he said. "I can handle it," she said, and meant it. "I know you can," he said. "That's not what I said." There was something in the directness of it, not the offer of rescue, but the offer of presence, that did something very inconvenient to her composure. She busied herself with the arrangement of tins on a shelf until she had recovered. Purvis tried one more time on Saturday, and this time he was less pleasant about it. He stood in the middle of the store and told her that a woman on her own in a cattle town had limited options, and that she ought to think carefully about refusing the help of someone who meant her well. He said this in a voice that was not loud but was meant to be heard by the other people in the store, which she understood as its own kind of threat, the suggestion that her refusal was impractical, that she was being foolish. Margaret Soles appeared from the back room with the expression of a woman who had been running a business in a cattle town for 15 years and was not going to be told what was sensible in her own establishment. "Mr. Purvis," she said, "I think you have finished your business here." Purvis left and did not return, and 2 days later he and his men rode out of Caldwell. Hester did not know where they went and did not much care, but she appreciated the swiftness of his departure, which she learned from Ray had something to do with a conversation that Henry had conducted at the saloon on Saturday evening, which she had not been present for and could not confirm, but which had apparently been brief and to the point. She thanked Henry for this, and he said only, "A man like that is looking for easy targets. You are not one. Sometimes that is all it takes." July was hot, and the ranch work was at its peak, and Henry began stopping by the store twice a week instead of once, and then sometimes midweek for reasons that had no very convincing connection to supplies. Hester began to look for him in the mornings when she opened the store. This was information she filed away carefully. One afternoon in the second week of July, he arrived near closing time and found her standing on the back steps of the store, watching a thunderstorm build in the west, the sky stacking up into those great dark towers of cloud that Kansas produces with a kind of theatrical extravagance in the summer. She heard him come around the building and did not turn around, and he came to stand beside her and look at the same sky. "Going to be a big one," he said. "Yes." They watched the lightning move inside the clouds for a while, still distant, rumbling like something dreaming. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can ask." "What are you going to do, in the long run?" He said it without looking at her, watching the storm. "You have been in Caldwell 2 months. You are good at what you do here. Margaret told me she doesn't know how she managed without you." But he stopped, and she heard him weighing something. "Is this where you want to be?" It was a serious question, and she gave it serious consideration. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I spent 3 years in Abilene finishing something. Before that I spent years helping my mother with the boarding house. I have been ending things for a long time." She watched the lightning. "I have not had a great deal of practice beginning them." He was quiet for long enough that the storm had noticeably grown. "Your mother's life," he said carefully. "The regret she carried. Are you afraid of something similar?" The question landed with a precision that made her breath catch, because it was the question she had been asking herself for 20 years without using those exact words, and hearing it spoken out loud in another person's voice was a different thing entirely. "Yes," she said. She kept her voice level. "I watched her carry it. I watched what it cost her. I have been very careful about not making choices that would leave me with that kind of weight." "Careful how?" "Careful enough to avoid most choices altogether," she said. And there was a wryness in it, but also an honesty that surprised her, coming out into the air like that. Henry turned and looked at her then, and the look on his face was not pity. She would not have tolerated pity, but something more careful and more genuine. Recognition, maybe. "I know something about that," he said. "After my father died I thought I had been watching him be lonely for 20 years, and I had told myself that was just how it was, that you could have the land and the work and that would be enough." He paused. "I am not certain any more that it is." The thunder came rolling across the prairie toward them, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall. "I should go before this opens up," he said, but he did not move immediately. Neither did she. "Henry," she said, and then was not quite sure what she wanted to say after his name, which was itself probably information. "I know," he said quietly, though she had not finished, and somehow she thought he did. He went. The storm came in full and enormous and spectacular, lightning cracking across the sky like the world was arguing with itself, rain hammering the roof of the general store where she had gone inside to close up, and Hester stood at the window and watched it and felt something moving in her chest that was not entirely comfortable and not entirely unwelcome. She had been careful for 20 years, careful not to want too much, careful not to hope too specifically, careful not to become her mother, which she had translated, somewhere along the way, into careful not to love anyone too deeply, because her mother had loved too deeply and had let that love sit unexpressed and unacted upon until it had rotted into something that poisoned 30 years of a life. She stood at the window in the storm and thought, what if the lesson was not to love less carefully, but to say it? What if the thing that had destroyed her mother was not the love, but the silence? In late July, Henry invited her to the 4th of July celebration which Caldwell observed on the 5th because the 4th had fallen on a Tuesday when everyone was working, and this time the invitation was less awkward, given with a directness that told her he had thought about it in advance and made a decision. "As my guest," he said, "not as neighbors being polite." "I understand the distinction," she said. "Good." A pause. "Is that a yes?" "That is a yes." The celebration was held on the edge of town, where the grassland was flat and wide enough for the gathering. There were horse races and a shooting competition and food that had been cooked by half the women in the county. There was a fiddle player who was genuinely talented and who had been known to play from sundown to midnight without stopping. There were children running in the grass, ranchers swapping information about the season, cowboys who had been paid recently and were investing in various entertainments. Henry stayed beside her for most of it. Not attached, not possessive, but present, turning to her when something was said, catching her eye across the space between conversations, finding her again when the crowd shifted. It felt like being sought, which was a thing she had not felt in a long time, and which worked on her in quiet ways throughout the afternoon. They danced when the fiddle started in the evening. She had not expected him to be a dancer, and he was not a graceful one, but he was sincere about it and he counted well, and he did not stand on her feet, which placed him in the top half of her dancing experience. They danced twice, and the second time the music slowed and he held her closer, and neither of them pretended the closeness was incidental. Walking back to the hotel in the soft dark of the summer night, fireflies lifting from the grass along the road, she said, "I am glad I stayed." He looked over at her. The starlight was enough to see his face. "I am glad too," he said. He walked her to the hotel door and stood there a moment on the step, and the night around them was warm and full of cricket sound, and she thought he was going to say something important, but he only said, "Good night, Hester," in a voice that made her name sound like something he had been keeping carefully. She went inside and sat on the bed in the dark for a long time, feeling the weight on her back. It had changed again, lighter, yes, but it was also different in quality, less like her mother's grief. More like her own question, "What are you waiting for?" In August, Henry asked her if she would come to the ranch for supper, not a casual visit this time. He had prepared for it, she could see this when she arrived, the table set with care, the food cooked properly rather than the functional work of a man eating alone. Ray and the other hands had made themselves scarce with what she suspected was not entirely natural coincidence. They ate and talked, easily and at length, the way they had learned to talk over the months, which was honestly and with attention. The food was good, he could cook. It turned out better than he had let on, something his mother had taught him before she died, and that he had maintained out of practical necessity. After supper they sat on the porch in the warm August night, the sky impossibly full of stars, the cattle quiet in the dark distance, and Henry said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. "I have been thinking about what you said, about your mother's regret, about not making choices that leave you carrying something like that." He was looking out at the dark land. "I think the two of us have been very careful with each other. I think we have been careful in a way that is starting to feel like a waste of something." She did not move. Her heart was doing something quick and thorough. "I think you are the most interesting person I have met in a long time," he said. "I think you are brave, not in the way of people who say they are brave, but in the way of people who keep going. And I think," he stopped, looked at her, "I think I would like to know you for a long time if you are willing." The night was very quiet. The crickets had found some rhythm that seemed almost intentional. "You are telling me how you feel," she said. "I am. Without performing it. I am not much for performing." She had known this. She had loved this about him for weeks without letting herself say the word, even silently. "Henry." "Yes. I have been watching you since May," she said. "I have been watching the way you treat your land, the way you talk to Ray, the way you speak plainly about things that other men dress up in nonsense. I have been watching the way you looked at me at the church supper like you were afraid I would disappear before you worked up to saying something." She felt herself smiling in the dark and let it happen. "And I have been very careful not to decide anything too quickly, because of my mother, because of that letter, because I was afraid. But I am less afraid than I was. And I think," she took a breath, "I think I would like to stay." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, which was a small gesture and also in that moment everything. "Good," he said softly. They sat there while the stars moved and the August night cooled slightly and the land around them breathed, and Hester Pritchard felt the weight on her back change for the third time in as many months. It was lighter. It was different. She could still feel it, the history of it, the shape of her mother's grief and her mother's silence, but it no longer felt like hers the same way it had. She thought about what Henry had said at the fence back in June, about the land holding everything that happens on it, about grief and good things existing in the same place at the same time. His hand was warm and certain around hers, and the land stretched out in every direction, and for the first time in 20 years, the weight felt like something she might be able to set down. September brought the cooling of the season and the winding down of the cattle drive, the town gradually returning to its smaller self, the drovers heading south, the money that had briefly flooded Caldwell beginning to ebb. It was a time Hester liked, the quieter town, the longer evenings, the sense of the land exhaling after the summer's exertion. She and Henry saw each other often. The care they had been taking with each other had not evaporated. They were still careful people, both of them, still inclined toward thought over impulse. But it was a different kind of care now. Not guardedness but attention. Not protection but presence. One afternoon in the third week of September, she was organizing the back of the general store when Margaret Soles came through from the front with an expression that Hester had learned to read as news-bearing. "There is a woman asking for you," Margaret said. "She came in on the noon coach, says she is your aunt." Hester straightened up from the box she had been sorting. "My aunt, Edith Marsh, says she is your mother's sister." Hester had not seen Edith Marsh in 12 years. They had not parted badly. Edith had simply lived a different life, had married a man from Missouri and moved away when Hester was a child, and had never had the easy relationship with Clara that would have brought her back often. She was a solid, practical woman of about 55, taller than Clara had been and less worn-looking, though she had the same gray eyes. They stood in the front of the general store and looked at each other for a moment, and then Edith said, "You look like her," and her voice had a crack in it that she covered quickly. "I know," Hester said. "Come in." They talked for several hours, first in the store and then at the hotel where Edith was staying. She had heard about Clara's death from a mutual acquaintance, but had been too far and too delayed to come for the funeral, and she had been carrying her own regret about that, a small private echo of the larger theme that Hester was beginning to recognize as something of a family tradition. "She wrote to me," Edith said, "near the end. She told me about the letter she wrote to Thomas Granger. She told me she was going to give it to you and ask you to deliver it." A pause. "Did you do it?" "I did." Edith was quiet for a moment. "Good, good. She needed someone to do that." She looked at Hester. "She needed to send it more than he needed to receive it, I think. She had been living with that thing wrapped around her heart for 30 years. I used to try to talk to her about it and she could not." She shook her head. "She was afraid." "She was," Hester agreed. "Are you?" The question was direct. Edith being the kind of woman who asked direct questions. Hester thought about Henry's hand in hers on the August porch, about the weight that had been changing shape. "Less than I was," she said. Edith stayed 3 days, and on her last evening in Caldwell, she met Henry at a supper that Hester arranged at the hotel's dining room. The two of them circled each other with the mutual assessment of people who care about the same person and are evaluating whether they ought to, and Hester watched this with a calm she felt in her chest rather than performed. At the end of the evening, walking Edith back to her room, Edith said, "He is very solid." "Yes. He looks at you like he is making sure you are still there." "I have noticed." "Good, notice it." A pause at the door. Clara stopped noticing at some point. She had convinced herself that what she had was what she deserved, and she stopped looking for anything else. Edith's voice was tired but not unkind. "You are smarter than she was, I think. Not because you are smarter, but because you are willing to look." Hester hugged her aunt, which surprised them both, and Edith held on for a moment longer than expected. Edith Marsh took the morning coach back to Missouri, and Hester stood on the boardwalk and watched it go and felt, quite clearly, the moment when something resolved in her. That evening she walked out to the edge of town and stood looking at the southeast, which was the direction of the Granger Ranch, which she could not see from here but knew was there, 6 miles away, with its good fence and its cottonwood trees and its windmill and its garden that needed attention. She thought about her mother. Not with grief this time, or not only with grief. With something more complicated, love, certainly, and sadness, and the long understanding of a person who has watched another person make choices that led away from happiness and has lived in the shadow of those choices for long enough to learn their shape very well. She thought, "I am not my mother. This is not that story." She thought, "I have been setting this down, a little at a time, and there is more to set down yet, but I am learning how." October came in clear and cold, the grass going golden, the light changing to the thin, slanted quality of the season. The cattle were settled for winter, the ranch work turning from the intensity of summer to the sustained maintenance of the colder months. Henry had more time in October than he'd had since spring, and they spent more of it together, rides along the creek, long evenings at the ranch with Ray, and sometimes the other hands present, the sociability of a group of people who had found a comfortable way of being together. Ray, Hester had discovered, was not merely a ranch hand in any narrow definition of the term. He had worked this land since before Henry was born, and knew its seasons and moods and history with an intimacy that came from decades of attention. He was funny in a quiet, dry way that caught you off guard, and he was the most honest person she had met outside of Henry himself. One afternoon he was showing her how to work with the horses, Henry's method, which Ray had largely taught him, and she asked, between the slow circles of a young horse on the long line, "How long have you known him?" "Since he was 3 years old," Ray said. "What was he like?" Ray considered. "Serious, even then." Thomas used to say the boy came out of the womb already thinking about something. A pause, watching the horse. He had a hard few years after his mother passed, turned inward, worked it through eventually. Land helped. He glanced at her. "You help too." She opened her mouth to demur from this observation and then closed it again, because Ray was not the kind of man who benefited from being argued with about things he had observed directly. "He is good for me too," she said. "I know that," Ray said. "I am not telling you something you don't know. I am just telling you I can see it." She walked back to the house after the horsework was done and found Henry in the kitchen making coffee, and she stood in the doorway looking at him, the straight line of his back, the way his hands moved, the particular quality of his focus when he was doing something simple and doing it well, and she thought, very clearly and without any of the usual careful hedging, "I love this man." It was the first time she had used the word, even in her own head. She went in and sat at the table and accepted her coffee, and they talked about the fence line on the south pasture that needed reinforcing before the winter, and she held the word inside her like something warm and thought, "I am going to say this eventually." And the thought did not frighten her nearly as much as she would have expected. November arrived, bringing its particular quality of prairie cold, the wind sweeping down from the north with real intent. The town had settled into its winter self, smaller, quieter, the daily rhythm slowed, the conversations in the general store running longer because there was less urgency to anywhere else. Margaret Soules, who missed very little of what occurred in her store and her town, said to Hester one morning while they were sorting through a new delivery, "He is going to ask you something important, you know." Hester looked up. "Margaret, I have known Henry Granger since he was a boy. He has not looked at anyone the way he looks at you." She continued sorting without looking up. "I am not saying this as any kind of pressure. I am saying it because you have been careful with yourself for a very long time, and I want you to be ready to answer." Hester set down the tin she was holding. "How do you know I have been careful?" "Because you are very good at it," Margaret said simply. "And because women who have been caring for other people's lives for a long time often need a moment to remember that they are allowed to have their own." This was true enough that Hester had no answer for it, and she stood very still for a moment in the middle of the store with the winter light coming through the windows and the smell of flour and tobacco and canvas around her, and she thought about permission. She had been giving herself small amounts of it since May. Permission to stay, permission to accept the coffee, permission to look for him on Friday mornings, permission to hold his hand on the August porch and to feel something large and warm about it. Permission to love him she had given herself in October, alone in the doorway of his kitchen. Maybe, she thought, the thing she needed to give herself permission for now was to say it. On a Thursday evening in mid-November, she rode out to the ranch, which was unusual because she normally waited for him to come to her, but she had been thinking all day, and she had decided that she was done waiting in the passive way of someone who was afraid of the conclusion. He was at the barn when she arrived, working on something by lantern light, and he heard her horse and came out and saw her and stopped. "Hester, is everything is fine," she said. She dismounted and tied her horse and walked up to him, and he was standing with the lantern held to one side and the night all around them, and his face in the lantern light was open and attentive. "I have been thinking about what I said in July," she told him, "about being careful, about not making choices that would leave me carrying something like my mother's regret." She stopped, made sure her voice was steady. "I have been examining what that means. Whether careful is the same thing as wise, or whether in some cases it is just a different name for afraid." He was very still. "My mother was afraid," she said. She was afraid of what her father would say and what her reputation would be and whether she could trust a feeling that was real and true and the best thing in her life. So she let it go. She let it go, and she never stopped grieving the letting. She could hear her own breath. "I have spent 20 years trying not to be that person, but I think I have been going about it wrong. I think I have been avoiding the feeling rather than trusting it, and those are not the same thing." Henry set the lantern on the fence post. "I love you," she said plainly, the way she had decided to say it. "I think I have since July at least, and probably before. And I am not saying this expecting anything from you except I am not willing to let this be the thing I do not say. I am done carrying things I should have set down." He crossed the space between them in 2 steps and took her face in his hands, and his hands were warm despite the November cold, and he looked at her with that dark, quiet look that she had learned to read like a second language. "Hester," he said. "Yes. I have been trying to find the right time to say this to you for 3 months." "You have said it now," she said. He kissed her then, in the light of the lantern with the cold night around them, and the cattle breathing softly in the barn, and the stars above the Kansas prairie doing their indifferent and magnificent work. And it was a kiss that had 3 months of careful feeling behind it, and it was nothing like her mother's silence. When they broke apart, his forehead was against hers, and he was breathing somewhat unevenly, and she thought she had perhaps never in her life felt so exactly where she was supposed to be. "You rode out here in the dark to say that," he said, and there was something between disbelief and admiration in his voice. "I decided I was finished waiting," she said. "I am glad of that," he said. "I am very glad of that." She stayed for supper, which they cooked together in the kitchen with an ease and familiarity that she noticed had been building for months without her fully registering it. The way they moved around each other in the small space without collision, the way they had established without discussing it, whose job was what. Ray came in from the bunkhouse for the meal as he occasionally did on cold evenings, and he looked between the two of them and said nothing beyond his usual remarks about the weather and the horses. But there was a quality to his silence that was satisfied, and Hester caught his eye once across the table, and he lifted one corner of his mouth. She rode back to town late, under the stars, and the night was cold and clear, and the grass was silver in the moonlight, and she went over and over the evening in her mind, not with the analytical care she had been applying to everything for months, but simply with the pleasure of it, the way you replay music that you want to hear again. December came. The ranch needed its winter work, the mending, the reinforcing against cold, the care of the cattle through the season, and Henry was busy with it. But he had developed the habit of coming into town 3 evenings a week, and they had developed the habit of walking together after she closed the store. The walks were short in December because the cold would not permit long ones, but they were sufficient for the purpose, which was being together, which both of them had stopped being careful about wanting. One evening, walking fast against a cold wind, he pulled her into the shelter of the side street between the store and the laundry and said, without preamble, "I want to ask you something." She looked up at him. He was serious, more serious than usual, which was already a high bar. "I have been thinking about this since September," he said. "I have been trying to be sure I was not rushing something and trying to be sure you had time enough here to know what you wanted." He paused. "I know it has been only 8 months. Henry, I know that is fast." "You are about to ask me something," she said. "Ask it." He took a breath. "Will you marry me? I want you here on this land in this house. I want the long version, the rest of it." His voice dropped. "I want you to set everything down here, whatever you have been carrying. You can set it down here and it can just be ours. Together." The cold wind was going directly down the back of her neck, and the night was very dark past the mouth of the alley, and she was aware of both these things the way you are aware of surroundings in a moment that is making a permanent mark on you. She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it since October, when she had first allowed herself to use the word love, even silently. She had thought about her mother's life, the wrong choice held onto, the right choice let go, and she had thought about what Margaret Soules said about permission, and what Edith said about noticing, and what she herself had said to Henry a month ago in front of the barn. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." He exhaled, and the breath clouded in the cold air between them, and then he was holding her, both arms, her face against the cold wool of his coat, and she could feel his heart going quickly under her ear. "Good," he said, in a voice that was rougher than usual. "Good." They stood there in the shelter of the buildings while the wind howled past the alley's mouth, and she thought about her mother's letter, unsigned and unsent for 30 years. She thought about the weight she had been carrying and about the way it had shifted and changed, and finally, at this moment in this alley in the cold Kansas December, felt as though it had been set down. Not discarded, not erased, set down, gently, deliberately, in a place where it could rest. They married in February of 1883 in the First Methodist Church in Caldwell, which was small enough that the gathered guests, Margaret Soules and her husband, who had recovered enough to attend, Ray and 2 of the other ranch hands, Edith Marsh, who had come all the way from Missouri on the winter coach, the sheriff and his wife, Mrs. Calloway from the hotel, and various others who had become part of the fabric of Hester's 8 months in the town, filled it completely. Hester wore a dress she had made herself over the winter evenings, plain but well cut, a deep blue that Margaret Soules said made her look like herself, which was the best possible review. Henry wore his good jacket and a new shirt and had gotten his hair cut, which he had been needing for months, and when she came down the aisle, such as it was in a small church with 8 rows of pews, and he turned and saw her, His face did the thing that Edith Marsh would later say she had never seen on a man's face except in very rare circumstances, which was total and unperformed happiness. Ray stood beside him as his second, and Edith sat in the front row with her handkerchief, and Hester walked toward Henry Granger in the cold February light and thought of nothing except the man in front of her and the life that was beginning. The minister was brief and decent about it. The vows were the traditional ones but said with the weight of people who meant them, and when he said, "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," the church was very quiet, and the cold outside pressed against the windows, and Hester and Henry looked at each other, and it felt like a fact about the world. Afterward there was food in the church hall and the fiddle player from the 4th of July celebration, and there was dancing, and Henry danced with her 4 times, which was progress. Ray danced once with Edith Marsh, which surprised everyone including apparently Ray. The evening ran long and warm and loud and generous, and when they finally left in Henry's wagon under the winter stars, the town lit behind them, Hester leaned her shoulder against his arm and felt not the absence of the weight exactly, but its transformation. It had become something different, not a burden, a history, something that had made her and that had led her here. Spring came back to the Kansas prairie the way it always does, abruptly, confidently, as though winter had simply been a temporary arrangement. The ranch woke up with it, the grass coming green and fast, the cattle getting their seasonal energy, the work picking up its pace. Hester had moved into the ranch house at the time of the wedding, and she had been reshaping it carefully and without haste into something that was both of theirs, not erasing what had been his but adding to it, the way a new season adds to a landscape without removing what was there before. She cleared out the back bedroom that had been storage and made it a proper room. She planted the garden in the first warm week of April, working alongside Henry, who claimed no expertise in gardening but was willing to learn. "Your father planted the cottonwood trees," she said one afternoon while they were working the garden plot, the trees visible at the edge of the east pasture. "He did." "What do you want to plant?" Henry looked at her over the row they were working. "What do you mean? He planted those trees. Your grandfather probably built the first fence. What do you want to add? What will this place hold of yours 30 years from now?" He was quiet for a moment, the way he got when he was thinking something through to its real answer. "I want it to hold something happy," he said. "I want it to hold the sound of—" He stopped. She waited. "Children," he said. "If that is something you want too." "It is something I want," she said, and went back to her planting with a calm that was real and complete. In June, she told him she was expecting. She said it in the kitchen after supper, putting it plainly because that was how they spoke to each other, and he looked at her for a very long moment with an expression that went through several things before settling on something she could only describe as reverent. "You are certain," he said. "I am certain." He came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took her hands, and he pressed his forehead to the back of her hands, the way a man does when he is feeling something too large for words, and she put her free hand on his hair and held on. "We are going to need a bigger garden," he said, into her hands, and she laughed, a real laugh, from the chest, the kind she had been finding herself having more often since February, and he looked up at her with that unguarded happiness, and she thought, "This is the beginning we were both waiting for." Ray received the news with a long pause and then a single nod and the statement, "Good," which from Ray was equivalent to a 10-minute speech from anyone else, and which made Henry laugh and Hester feel she had been properly welcomed. Edith Marsh wrote a letter that arrived in August, when Hester's pregnancy was well established and the summer was at its height, and the letter was full of warmth and practical advice, and ended with a paragraph that Hester read 3 times. "I told your mother once that she was the bravest person I knew, and I meant it, because courage is not the absence of fear but the choosing anyway. I did not know then that I was wrong, because courage is more than that. Your mother was afraid and she chose the safe road and she lived with it, and she was in her own way very brave, because she kept going in a life that had cost her what she most wanted. But you, Hester, you chose the other road. Not because you were not afraid, because I know you were, but because you decided that the fear was not the whole story. I think that is a different and better kind of bravery. Clara would have agreed if she had let herself. Hester folded the letter and put it in the drawer where she kept important things, the few remaining letters from her mother, a photograph of Clara when she was young and still hopeful looking, a small dried flower from her wedding bouquet. And she sat for a while with her hands on her stomach, and the summer sounds coming through the open window, and thought about bravery and fear, and the stories we tell ourselves about our own limitations. She thought, I have set it down, most of it, the parts that were hers. I am allowed to carry what is mine. And what was hers now was light. Was Henry's laugh in the kitchen and the garden coming up and the cottonwood leaves turning in the fall and Ray teaching her more about the horses and the land, remembering everything, all of it, the grief and the good, stored in the grass and the creek and the good fence and the sound of the windmill. The baby arrived in February of 1884, exactly 1 year after the wedding, as if he had been deliberate about the timing. He was a boy, healthy and loud about it, with Henry's dark eyes and a will of his own that announced itself immediately and did not show any signs of diminishing. They named him Thomas. Henry held his son in the thin winter light of their bedroom and looked at the small face with an expression that Hester could not quite describe but did not need to, because she was seeing it, and that was sufficient. She was tired and aching and more awake than she had ever been in her life, and from the bed she watched Henry hold Thomas Granger and thought of all the roads that had led here, her mother's 30 years of silence, the unsent letter, the long ride to Caldwell, the coffee on the table and the church supper and the August porch and the November barn and the cold December alley and the February wedding. And she thought, all of it, every single piece of it brought us here. Ray came to the house the following morning, hat in hand, and looked at the baby with the expression of a man receiving news he already knew but was glad to hear confirmed. He looks like Thomas, Ray said. The senior Thomas, around the eyes. Henry, who had barely slept and was luminous with it, said, We named him for my father. Ray nodded slowly. Good, he said again, and this time it landed differently with the weight of history, the acknowledgement of continuity, the recognition that things pass forward as well as backward, that the land holds the new as well as the old. Spring came again, and the ranch moved into its rhythms, and Hester worked the garden and learned the land and helped with the horses under Ray's patient instruction, and grew into the life she had not quite known she was building until she was already inside it. She wrote to Edith every month. She wrote a letter once to a woman in Abilene who had known her mother, telling her about the ranch and the marriage and the baby, telling her that Clara Pritchard's daughter had found something good. She kept the original letter, the one her mother had written, in the drawer with the other important things, not because she needed to read it anymore, but because it was a part of how she had gotten here, and she was not interested in pretending that the road had been anything other than what it was. The weight in the end had not vanished. You do not lose 20 years of carried grief the way you lose a coin from a pocket. It had transformed. It had become the story she knew of herself, the thing that had shaped her and driven her 6 miles out of Caldwell on a May afternoon with a dead woman's letter in her saddlebag, toward a fence line, and a man working a horse in the yard who had dark, quiet eyes and nothing to hide. She thought about this sometimes in the mornings early, before Henry was awake, and before Thomas had started the announcement of his wakefulness that had become the ranch's daily alarm clock. She thought about the mechanics of regret, how it is not the loving that creates it but the silence, and how the antidote is not caution but voice. She had a voice. She had always had one. She had been afraid to use it on her own behalf, which was different from not having it. She used it now. In the summer of 1884, Caldwell was growing and changing, the cattle trade at full swing, the town adding buildings at a rate that spoke of confidence in its own future. There were injustices embedded in this growth, as there were in the whole expansion of the frontier land taken from the Comanche and Osage and Cherokee. The displacement of peoples whose relationship with this territory ran far deeper than the memory of any town. Henry spoke of this with his characteristic plainness, and Hester listened. And when a Chickasaw family came through the county looking for a place to settle, it was Henry who helped them file a land claim and Ray who vouched for them at the county office, and it was Hester who brought them food that first winter. This was what the land required, Henry said, that you treat it with honesty and care, and that you understood what it had cost to be here at all, and that you acted accordingly where you could. He was not a man given to large political speeches, but he was consistent in this, and she loved him for it. In the autumn of 1884, when Thomas was starting to pull himself upright against the furniture, and Ray was teaching him the names of the horses with the patience of a born teacher, Henry came in from the east pasture one evening with a look on his face that she recognized as the look of a man who had been thinking something through to its conclusion. "The cottonwoods by the creek need some company," he said. She was nursing Thomas and looked at him over the baby's head. "Is that so?" "I was thinking about what you asked me, what I want to plant, what I want this land to hold." He sat down across from her. "I want to plant an orchard, on the south slope past the pasture line, apple trees. Maybe pear." He paused. "They will not produce for years, but they will be here. They will be here when Thomas is older and when—" He stopped himself. "When," she said. He looked at her and there was something careful and hopeful in his face. "When there are more children, maybe, if you are willing." She was 3 months along as it happened. She had been waiting for the right moment. "I was going to tell you Sunday," she said. He went very still. Then a slow, complete smile moved across his face, the kind he did not often produce but which, when it appeared, was worth everything. "Sunday," he said. "I thought it would keep until Sunday." "It has kept," he said. Thomas, unaware of any of this, was engaged with his own excellent priorities. Outside, the autumn was going gold on the hills, and the cottonwood trees by the creek were turning in a brilliant scatter of yellow, and somewhere out in the pasture Ray was moving the cattle with the efficient ease of a man entirely at home in his work and his place. And the windmill was turning, and the land was holding all of it, the new and the old. The grief set down and the joy picked up. The apple trees not yet planted, and the cottonwoods that had been growing for 30 years and would be growing for 30 more. The second child, born in the spring of 1885, was a girl. They named her Clara, and Henry said the name the first time he held her with a gentleness that told Hester he understood what the name carried and was willing to help carry it. Not as burden, but as honor, the way you honor the people who made you even when their stories were hard. Clara Granger, from her earliest weeks, had a look about her of knowing something. Her grandmother's gray eyes and her father's steady attention and her mother's jaw, which was, by all accounts, the jaw of a woman who had decided things. Hester sat with both her children in the lengthening spring evenings and watched the land and felt, not the absence of the past but its right relationship to the present behind her, visible, no longer astride her back. She had set it down, not all at once and not cleanly, and not without the assistance of a man who had offered his land as the place for it, which she had thought at first was the strangest possible thing to offer, and which she now understood was the most generous. Land, as Thomas Granger the elder had said, holds everything that happens on it. Grief and good things, the history and the new, the silence and the voice. It does not discriminate, it simply holds. Hester Pritchard Granger was 34 years old in the spring of 1885, and she was in love with her husband and her children and her life with a clarity and fullness that she suspected some people never managed at all. She had not come by it easily. She had come by it by riding 6 miles with an old letter, and by letting herself stay, and by saying the hard, true things, and by choosing, again and again, the road that her mother had been afraid to take. She wrote to Edith and told her about Clara. Edith wrote back, "I am glad, I am so glad. Tell her when she is old enough about her grandmother. Tell her all of it, the regret and the fear and the love. Tell her that Clara Pritchard loved as deeply as anyone, and that love does not require a good ending to have been real. And tell her that her mother chose differently, and that the choosing was an act of love too for herself, and for everyone who came after. Hester folded the letter and put it in the drawer, which was getting full of important things, which was, she thought, exactly right. One evening in the late summer of 1885, when the children were both asleep and the August heat had thinned to something bearable, she and Henry sat on the porch in the chairs that had been there since before she arrived, looking out at the land going dark in the long western sunset. The grass was gold and the sky was doing what Kansas skies do in August, burning itself out in oranges and purples and colors that had no good names. "Henry," she said, "I want you to know something." He turned to look at her, his face half-shadowed, half-lit. "When I rode out here," she said, "that first day, I thought I was delivering a letter. I thought I was paying a debt that wasn't mine, closing out a chapter of someone else's story." She paused. "I did not know I was arriving somewhere." He was quiet. "I did not know that this," she gestured at the land, the house, the dark pasture, the invisible presence of the sleeping children inside, was waiting. "I had been moving my whole life, it feels like, ending things, taking care of things, getting through things. I did not know that I was allowed to arrive." "You arrived," he said simply. "I did." She looked at him. "You helped me. You helped yourself. He thought for a moment. "I just made it clear that there was a place here if you wanted one." She reached for his hand in the dark. He took it. The sky darkened slowly, and the stars came out in their extravagant Kansas numbers, and the crickets found their register, and somewhere a cow made a sound of contentment in the near pasture. Inside, Thomas slept the confident sleep of a child who had never known want, and Clara slept her newish sleep with her grandmother's eyes closed, and her mother's stubbornness in the set of her small chin. The orchard on the south slope had been planted in April, 12 apple trees and 4 pear, small and determined in their new earth. They would not bear fruit for years. They would be taller than Thomas when they first produced. They would shade Clara's children, perhaps, or Thomas's, or both. They were there now, those trees, growing. The land held them, the way it held everything, the old grief, the new joy, the letter in the drawer, the name on the grave 2 years in the ground, the name of a living girl sleeping inside, the warmth of 2 hands connected in the August dark, and the whole bright fact of a life that had been chosen, fully and with open eyes, without apology and without regret. Hester Pritchard had carried her mother's regrets for 20 years, worn them into her spine and her manner and her careful way of moving through the world. She had carried them 6 miles out of Caldwell on a May morning, and she had set them down, not all at once, but piece by piece, on this land, in this life, in the hands of this man who had asked her to stay and who had meant it, who had offered her his land as the place where the weight could finally rest, and had kept that offer open and patient until she was ready to take it. She had taken it, and in its place she carried something new, lighter and warmer and entirely her own. The weight of love chosen freely, of a life lived with her voice, of 2 children sleeping inside, and the apple trees growing in the south field, and the cottonwoods at the creek, and the good fence standing straight against whatever the prairie sent at it. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.